NDE 1. When I was 7 years old, I went to a beach with a friend. We decided to climb a cliff. We were up about 20 meters when I became stuck. My friend went around the cliff face to tell her mother. My hands began to slip and my legs shook uncontrollably. My fingers slipped off the rocks and I began to fall backwards. As I was falling, I opened my eyes to see that I was upside down and that I seemed to be looking out of a tunnel. I couldn't hear or feel anything. I had opened my eyes 2 times on the way down and I was still upside down. I still couldn't hear or feel anything. I was conscious to the fact that I was bouncing and hitting the cliff. I remember thinking it was taking a long time to get to the bottom. Everything was in slow motion, but at no point was I scared. I wasn't aware of landing, but I opened my eyes to find I was laying on the ground with my head tilted back. I still couldn't feel or hear, but I saw a lady standing a couple of meters away from me. This lady was white. She had a long white see-through dress with long white hair. She seemed to glow. I was wondering why she wasn't helping me. She just stood there and smiled at me. I thought I must have been dead. That's why she wouldn't help me. When I decided to ask her for help, she seemed to read my mind. I was asking, but I wasn't saying it out loud, I just seemed to think it. I asked her to help me, but she just stood there. I kept asking. The more I asked, the more she wouldn't help, the more I became distressed. I had asked her approximately 3 or 4 times. On the last time I asked, she replied, "You're all right," and smiled. I said, "No, I'm not," as she smiled and went away. I closed my eyes, then my senses started coming back. I could now feel and hear. I started screaming when my friend's mother came. I asked if I was dead. The obvious answer was no. I told her the lady wouldn't help me. She asked, "What lady?" I said the white lady, but there was nobody around. As I was lifted to my feet, the only injuries I had were grazes to my legs. When we looked up the cliff face, I should have been dead or seriously injured. NDE 2. I had an accident during a motor race. I slammed into 2 cars in front of me. Exactly when I had the hit, I seemed to be lifted out of the car and then hovered above it. I saw everything in detail, the color of my helmet, everything. The car was even still moving a bit. I did not hear noise or speech and the feeling in general was peaceful. I was not afraid, only taken away and taking the experience in. I would like to experience the same thing again, as it was very special. Then suddenly, I must have regained consciousness again, and I was sitting normally in the car. NDE 3. When I was in my early 20s, I had something resembling a cancer scare. I had precancerous cells on the cervix of my uterus, and I required a procedure called a cone biopsy. This is typically not a dangerous procedure, but afterwards, one must take care to avoid interfering with the surgery site. No baths, no sex, and no heavy lifting. The prohibition I had difficulty sticking to was the no heavy lifting. I had a toddler. We heated the house by wood. 7 days after the surgery, I was hitching the baby on one hip and loading the wood on the other. I went to bed that night and awakened in a small pool of blood. When I stood, the flood of red grew. I held sanitary pads to myself, but they were spent in a very short time. I held baby diapers, then towels, and then glasses from the cupboard to myself, to catch the flow. I realized I was bleeding to death. I called the ambulance, set out a flashing light on the rural road, and awakened a neighbor to watch my child. The emergency folk arrived, took my story, and we set out for the 1-hour drive to the hospital. On the way, I lost about half my blood before losing consciousness. Dying or dead? I don't know. All I know is I went from being terribly, bone-deep, chatteringly cold and bleeding in an ambulance, to the brightest and warmest place imaginable. These are not facile descriptors. The light was like an explosion of golden yellow, accompanied by the most exquisite warmth. It is not enough to say it enveloped me. It was me, a mellow sun, a languorous day, a paradise of contentment. All was one. It was the most sublime pleasure I have ever felt. I basked in this place, even as I thought I am dying. I thought of my death at the same time as I thought of my life. But I was not thinking. Everything was happening at the same time, the sensuous basking in this beautiful light, my death, my life. I was afraid for my daughter. When the emergency medical technician waved an ammonia ampoule under my nose, I came back to the ambulance, and I gave them the phone number for my parents. We arrived at the hospital, they repaired the erupted cervical artery, and took me off the oxygen. My blood was drawn and tested. My blood values were low, so they gave me 2 units of packed cells via a blood transfusion. I think of this as the time I almost died, or the time I decided not to die. I am fascinated by the near-death experiences of others. The random firings of an underperfused brain or heaven, tales of the light, the tunnel, and the beckoning figures. And even as I vote in favor of the lack of oxygenated blood to the brain versus heaven, I wonder. What benevolent thing makes our last minutes like this, welcoming, light, warm, and full of joy?